Thank you very much for the invitation. As I mentioned to Nitish just before the seminar, really a significant portion of the research that my group is doing has been inspired by research by the science that many people in the audience are doing. So I really, truly appreciate the opportunity to share some of my group's research with you today. Now, my group is interested in electrocatalysis, and many electrocatalytic processes of current interest involve the transfer of multiple protons and multiple electrons. Examples include the oxidations of methane and alcohols, and also the reductions of nitrogen, nitrate, and CO2. And all these processes share a common challenge, namely the poor selectivity for specific desired products. And the electrochemical reduction of CO2 to hydrocarbons is prototypical for this class of reactions. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on this reaction. It has been discovered over 30 years ago by Hori and co-workers in Japan, who found that we can take CO2 and bubble it through an aqueous electrolyte, and upon application of a sufficiently cathodic potential to a copper electrode, we see the conversion of CO2 into hydrocarbons such as methane and ethylene. And ethylene is a particularly interesting product. It is a high-value commodity chemical. So in principle, the electrochemical reduction of CO2 could provide a sustainable pathway to this important commodity chemical. However, as I mentioned, there are two interrelated issues with this, or challenges associated with this electrochemical process. The first is that this reaction requires significant overpotential to drive the reduction reaction, and also under typical conditions, we see low Faradaic efficiencies for ethylene on the order of 25%, depending on the reaction conditions. So the question is, how can we make this process energetically more efficient and also more selective? And the answer to this question is, we need to better control the reaction environment. And in electrocatalysis, we of course deal with an asymmetric reaction environment that is composed of both the electrode and the electrolyte. And both these factors determine the catalysis that is happening at the interface. Now it is straightforward to understand how the electrode would influence an electrocatalytic process. Specifically, the exposed crystallographic facet and surface morphology will determine to what extent and in what configuration reaction intermediates bind to the surface. However, in the context of electrocatalysis, this is only half the story. We also have to take into account intermolecular interactions between reaction intermediates and electrolyte species. For example, the electrolyte contains cations that produce strong local electric fields that may influence the reaction pathway. We have interfacial water that may act as a proton donor, but also provides the solvation environment. And we also have solution species that may buffer the interfacial pH to different extents and may also act as proton donors and acceptors in the reaction. So therefore, it is critical to understand how reaction intermediates interact with this interfacial environment, and then how this interfacial environment controls the product selectivity at the interface. And that is what my group is focusing on. Now, to what extent does the electrolyte influence an electrocatalytic process such as the electrochemical reduction of CO2? It does so quite profoundly. Let me give you one example. This is work by Bell and co-workers who carried out the electrochemical reduction of CO2 under the conditions listed above. And you can see when they carry out this reaction in a lithium-containing electrolyte, hydrogen is the preferred product, whereas the process exhibits little selectivity for ethylene. On the other hand, upon switching to cesium-containing electrolyte, the Faradaic efficiency for hydrogen drops by about a factor of 2, whereas the selectivity for ethylene increases by almost a factor of 6. So clearly, cations can affect the structure of the electrochemical double layer and therefore influence the product selectivity. However, how the cations influence on a mechanistic level the product selectivity is still poorly understood. The reason for this poor mechanistic understanding is because cations can influence an electrocatalytic process in a number of distinct ways. For example, the cations can change the electrostatics at the interface. They may block active sites. They may directly chemically interact with reaction intermediates. Hydrated alkali cations can buffer the interfacial pH to different extents. And also the cations can reorganize the structure of interfacial water, which not only provides the solvent environment, but also participates in these reactions. However, distinguishing between or identifying the relative importance of these effects is a formidable experimental challenge. And in the first project that I'd like to introduce, we wanted to directly address this challenge. So the first question is, what type of reaction do we want to study? Of course, we want to study a reaction in which we can observe a relevant reaction intermediate. So therefore, we chose to study the reduction of surface-absorbed CuAu to ethylene. The reduction of surface-absorbed CuAu corresponds to the rate-determining step in the electrochemical reduction of CO2 to ethylene. So therefore, understanding the reaction kinetics of this intermediate is essential for understanding the overall process of electrochemical CO2 reduction. Importantly, with infrared spectroscopy, we can relatively straightforwardly determine the relative CO coverages in the presence of different cations. And equally important, with infrared, the surface-absorbed CuAu, the CO stretch mode of surface-absorbed CuAu is sensitive to the interfacial electric field strength. So with this intermediate, we have a direct molecular probe of the electrocatalytic interface. The next question is, what type of cations do we want to choose for our study? Now, most studies in the electrochemical reduction of CO2 are carried out in the presence of alkali metal cations. However, alkali metal cations are Lewis acids. And because they're Lewis acids, hydrated alkali metal cations can buffer the interfacial pH to different extents. And because they're Lewis acids, they may directly chemically interact with surface-absorbed CuAu, which is a Lewis base. To avoid these complications, we chose for our study quaternary alkyl ammonium cations. These are not Lewis acids. But importantly, by going from one quaternary alkyl ammonium cation to another, we can systematically tune the width of the Helmholtz double layer, and therefore we can control the strength of the interfacial electric field at a given applied potential. Let me expand on that last point a little bit further. So if we first focus here on this table, we can see as we go from tetramethylammonium to tetrabutylammonium, the ionic radius is increasing. Now, if we focus here on this cartoon, we see here the electrode, here the electrolyte. The line here represents the position of the outer Helmholtz plane. That is the plane of closest approach of hydrated ions to the surface. And the position of this plane relative to the surface of the electrode is in part determined by the size of the cation. So therefore, for a given interfacial potential drop, or in other words, for a given applied electrode potential, we can control the strength of the interfacial electric field by going from one cation to another. Now, we were, of course, very interested to learn to what extent these cations influence the reduction of CO to ethylene. To answer this question, we employed a differential electrochemical mass spectrometry setup. In this setup, we use a porous Teflon tip that we bring close to a copper electrode. The Teflon is there to reject water. However, upon application of a sufficiently cathodic potential to the copper electrode, we see the conversion of CO into volatile substances such as ethylene. These volatile substances can penetrate through the porous Teflon tip and then be detected in the mass spectrometric chamber. Now, before I walk you through the results, let me briefly state the experimental conditions. So these DEMS measurements were carried out in CO saturated electrolyte at a bulk pH of 9.5. We chose this pH to be close to the counter ion is borate. So we chose that bulk pH to be close to the pKa of boric acid. So this is a pH buffered system that does not contain any cations other than the quaternary ammonium cations. Now, if we focus on this graph, we see here the ethylene partial pressure detected by the DEMS system following a sequence of potential steps. We only have to focus on this center part of the graph, which shows the amount of ethylene detected by the DEMS at the reaction potential. And you can clearly see only in the presence of tetramethyl and tetraethylammonium do we observe a ethylene formation, but we do not observe ethylene formation in the presence of the two larger cations. Now, we carried out very careful control experiments to ensure that the ethylene we detect is indeed due to the reaction of CO on the copper electrode and not, for example, due to the decomposition of the organic cations. Now, with this established, we're left with a task to explain why the selectivity for ethylene changes so drastically as we change the size of the cation. To answer this question, we employed surface-enhanced infrared absorption spectroscopy. In this technique, we deposit a thin polycrystalline copper film on a silicon ATR crystal. We use an electroless deposition method that results in a roughened surface. These roughened surfaces give rise to an enhanced evanescent field that is restricted within a few nanometers of the electrode surface. So this renders the technique surface sensitive. Now, we couple this to a full electrochemical cell, which then allows us to sweep the potential in the cathodic direction, and we can concurrently collect the CO stretch band of surface absorbed CO, which is shown here. Now, if we integrate this band, we obtain a quantity that is approximately proportional to the CO surface coverage, which is shown here. So this is the integrated CO band area versus applied potential in the presence of the four different cations. And you can clearly see, irrespective of the cation that is present in solution, we obtain approximately the same CO saturation coverage. This result suggests that the drastic changes in ethylene selectivity that we observe are not due to site blocking effects by the cations. Now, with this result established, we were eager to learn to what degree these cations alter the strength of the interfacial electric field. And to analyze that, or to determine that, we analyzed the peak frequency of the CO stretch band, which is plotted here. Peak frequency of the CO stretch band as a function of applied potential in the presence of the four different cations. And you can see linear relationships are obtained, and the slopes of these lines are known as the Stark tuning slopes. And you can see these slopes decrease with increasing cation size. And this is expected because the electrochemical Stark tuning slopes are directly proportional to the strength of the interfacial electric field. And we would expect the weakest interfacial electric field in the presence of the largest cation that gives rise to the widest Helmholtz double layer width. Now, we can take this a step forward. We can calculate the absolute strength of the interfacial electric field. Now, why is the CO stretch frequency changing as a function of applied potential? Well, this is a manifestation of the vibrational Stark effect. which tells us how the frequency of a vibrational mode changes under the influence of an external electric field. So we measured the vibrational frequency and as a function of potential, and we want to know the electric field as a function of potential. Now, to do so, we need to know two additional quantities, delta mu and omega PCZ. Now, delta mu is the Stark tuning rate of surface absorbed CO, which is a molecular constant of surface absorbed CO, and it is known from calculations. Now, omega PZC is the frequency of the CO, of surface absorbed CO, in the absence of an interfacial electric field, that is at the potential of zero charge of the electrode. And we can estimate the potential of zero charge of the copper electrode in the presence of our cations or our electrolytes on the basis of the CO stretch peak frequency as a function of applied potential. You can see for the three largest cations, these lines all cross at one potential around minus 1.1 volts versus SHE, and that is the approximate potential of zero charge of the copper electrode in the presence of our electrolytes. Now, the line for tetramethylammonium does not go through the same point. I have an answer to that, and we can talk about that in the Q&A session. Now, with this, we can now determine the interfacial electric field strength in the presence of the different cations. So here we have the electric field versus applied potential in the presence of the four different cations. And you can clearly see as we go from tetrabutylammonium to tetramethylammonium, the electric field strength increases by about a factor of 2.5. However, more importantly, we're now in a position to calculate the electrostatic contribution to the CO adsorption energy. And that electrostatic contribution is given by this equation here, where mu and alpha are the dipole moment and polarizability of surface absorbed CO. And this equation evaluates to a couple of millielectron volts, meaning that electrostatic effects are negligible on the basis of this measurement, because the chemisorption energy of CO on copper is on the order of half an electron volt. Now, with this, we can summarize that in our system, it appears that electrostatic changes with cation size are not the origin of the selectivity changes that you're seeing. On the basis of our measurements, we can also exclude side blocking effects, and our cations are not Lewis acids, so therefore that minimizes the chemical interactions between CO and the cations. Our cations are not Lewis acids, so they can also, the hydrated forms cannot buffer the interfacial pH to different extents. So that leaves us with the last point. To what degree do these cations impact the structure of interfacial water? To answer this question, we looked at the OH stretch of interfacial water. Now, before I walk you through the spectrum, I should point out that all our spectroscopy was carried out in heavy water. So this is the OH stretch of heavy water. You can see on top of that broad OH stretch, there's a sharp band around 2,710 wave numbers. And it is very well established what this band is due to. It is due to water molecules that are in direct contact with the CO add layer, in which their hydrogen points towards the terminal oxygen of the CO molecule. And you can see that this band is prominent in the presence of tetramethyl and tetraethylammonium. It is much weaker in the presence of tetrapropylammonium, and it is entirely absent in the presence of tetrabutylammonium. Now, this trend in this band qualitatively correlates with the selectivity changes that we are seeing. Now, why would the structure of water impact the formation of ethylene? Now, the mechanism of ethylene formation is still under debate. However, spectroscopic evidence and theoretical work have strongly suggested or agree that the coupling of two surface adsorbed CO molecules form the rate determining step in this reaction. And very recently, Jan Rossmeisel and co-workers carried out an ab initio molecular dynamics simulation of this coupling process on a copper 100 surface in the absence and in the presence of water molecules. And what they found is that in the presence of water molecules, this dimer, that CO dimer, is stabilized through hydrogen bonding. However, when the water is removed, this stabilization is no longer present and the dimer formation does not occur. So inspired by these theoretical insights, we propose the following interpretation. The smaller cations, such as tetramethylammonium, do not disrupt the interaction between interfacial water and the CO add layer. So therefore, as evidenced by the spectroscopy, so therefore these waters are available to stabilize the dimer once it forms. On the other hand, the larger cations, which are more hydrophobic, expel water from the interface, as evidenced by the infrared spectroscopy. So therefore, these waters are no longer available to stabilize the dimer formation. Now, in this cartoon, I drew the tetramethylammonium closer to the surface than the tetrabutylammonium. And again, this is based on our spectroscopic results. When we calculate the interfacial electric field strength on the basis of the star tuning slopes, it is important to note that this calculation is independent of the assumption of a specific double layer model. However, when we look at this graph, CO stretch frequency versus applied potential, we see that we obtain a linear relationship. That implies that also the electric field strength is linearly dependent on the applied potential. And a double layer model that is consistent with that observation is the Helmholtz double layer model. Now, if we assume a simple Helmholtz double layer model, then the star tuning slope that we extract from fitting these our data, from the star tuning slope, we can extract the width of the Helmholtz double layer. And if we do so, we find that the tetramethylammonium is situated at a distance approximately equal to its ionic radius from the surface, whereas tetrabutylammonium is situated at a distance that is approximately equal to the length of a surface absorbed CO molecule plus the ionic radius of the tetrabutylammonium ion. Now, with this, I'd like to kind of conclude this first project. So we were able to, with our infrared spectroscopy, identify an intermolecular interaction that is apparently of critical importance for the formation of ethylene during CO reduction. Now, what I just talked about is one example of a cation effect. But as you know, cation effects can be very complex. They can be various different, they can influence catalysis through various different mechanisms. And last year, we tried to summarize the state of the current understanding of these cation effects in an invited perspective in the Journal of Chemical Physics. Now, I'd like to transition now to the second part of my talk. So apart from understanding how the electrolyte side influences electrocatalytic processes, we're also very interested in probing the ensemble of catalytically active sites on electrodes of complex surface morphologies. We're particularly interested in rough copper electrodes. Rough metal electrodes are often found to convert CO and CO2 at high reaction rates to desirable hydrocarbons, and they do so with good reaction selectivity in comparison with their smooth counterparts. Let me give you one example. This is work by Kenneth and Wirth and co-workers who carried out the electrochemical reduction of CO2 under the conditions listed here. and they found for their rough copper nanowires, these rough electrodes produce ethylene at a Faradaic efficiency of about 40% in comparison to polycrystalline copper foils, which only exhibit a Faradaic efficiency of 1% under the same reaction conditions. Now, the desirable catalytic properties of rough copper electrodes certainly arise from a combination of different reasons. However, the atomic level surface morphology is certainly a critical component that brings about this desirable product spectrum. However, attributing specific atomic level features to the desirable catalytic activity is very challenging. It has been variably attributed to the prevalence of certain surface facets, the appropriate surface concentration of etch and kink sites, the presence of kinetically stable oxide phases or other metastable sites. And more recently, Jaramillo and co-workers have argued that the desirable product spectrum is to a significant extent due to the suppression of the hydrogen evolution rather than due to the promotion of the CO2 or CO reduction reactions. These diverging views, there are principally two reasons for these diverging views. The first is that very few methods are available to probe the atomic level surface morphology of rough electrodes during electrochemistry. And the methods that can probe the surface morphology of the atomic level surface morphology, such as spectroscopy, typically require reaction conditions that are quite distinct from those that are employed during typical product detection schemes. Let me give you two examples. First, in spectroscopy, we often probe the interface on a time scale of a few minutes, whereas in product detection schemes, it is typical to run the catalysis for tens of minutes. Also, the reaction conditions can be quite different. It's not atypical to use static electrolytes in spectroscopy, whereas flow cells are often employed when doing product detection. So that means that spectroscopy may probe a state of the interface that is quite distinct from the state of the surface under typical product detection conditions. Now, we wanted to address this challenge, and of course, what we want to do is we want to do spectroscopy and product detection on the same electrode at the same time under the same reaction conditions. And to do so, we coupled our surface-enhanced infrared absorption spectroscopy cell to a differential electrochemical mass spectrometer. In this way, we can do product detection while we're probing the interface in real time. Now, the answer we wanted to ask is, what are the atomic level features that make some rough copper electrodes more active in the formation of CC bonds in comparison to other copper electrodes? And as model systems, we employed two types of rough SEIRAS-Active copper electrodes. The first electrode is produced through an electroless deposition method, and I'm going to refer to that electrode as copper silicon. This procedure means we're directly depositing a copper film on the silicon ATR crystal. This procedure results in a film of nanoscopic roughness, as shown in this AFM image. And with electrochemical capacitance measurements, we can calculate the roughness of that surface with respect to that of a smooth polycrystalline copper foil, and we find a roughness factor of about 10. The second electrode is an electrochemically deposited copper film on a gold substrate, and I'm going to refer to this film as copper gold silicon. This again results in a film of nanoscopic roughness, surface roughness, and electrochemical capacitance measurements show that it has a roughness factor of about 5. Now, we were very interested to learn we wanted to assess the catalytic activity of these two types of films with our differential electrochemical mass spectrometer. So we observed the evolution of hydrogen, methane, and ethylene during CO reduction. I should point out that all the signals that you see on these graphs were divided by these respective surface roughness of the electrodes. These measurements were also carried out in a phosphate buffer at neutral pH. So let's first focus on the evolution of hydrogen. You can see both electrodes exhibit similar onset potentials for the formation of hydrogen. The same can be said about the onset potential of methane. In stark contrast to that, we can see that the ethylene onset potential on the copper gold silicon film is shifted by about 200 millivolts in the cathodic direction relative to the onset potential for this product on the copper silicon film. So the key question we want to ask now is, why is copper silicon so much more efficient in catalyzing CC bond formation in comparison to the copper gold silicon electrode? To answer this question, we employed surface absorbed CO as a molecular probe of the atomic level surface structure of the electrodes. So the spectra that you see here were collected concurrently with the DEMS measurements that we just discussed. So you can clearly see, so this is the CO stretch spectrum of surface absorbed CO, of a top bound CO, as we tune the potential in the cathodic direction for the copper silicon and copper gold silicon electrodes. And you can clearly see when you compare these two graphs that the line shapes are very specific to the specific electrode. So let us first look at the CO stretch spectrum on copper silicon. We can see at moderate cathodic potentials, a band at 2045 wave numbers dominates, and only at more cathodic potentials do we see a band at 2080 wave numbers. In stark contrast to that, on copper gold silicon, we see that the band at 2080 wave numbers dominates at all potentials, and the 2045 wave number band never appears as a distinct band, so you can estimate its presence based on the asymmetry of this band. Now, these line shapes contain atomic level information on of the electrode surfaces. So now to interpret or to extract that information, we need to analyze these line shapes. So let's start by analyzing the spectra in the top graph, where we can clearly see two distinct bands. We can assign these two distinct bands to CO atop on terrace and defect sides on the basis of prior spectroscopic studies where single crystals were used. So Hori and co-workers found that on copper 100 electrodes, the CO stretch peak frequency is at about 2045 wave numbers, whereas on stepped single crystals, they found a peak frequency of 2080 wave numbers. Now, indeed, we can nicely model our spectrum by the sum of two Gaussian functions, and on the basis of the single crystal on the spectroscopy on the single crystal electrodes, we can confidently assign the lower frequency band to CoA top on terrace sides and the 2080 wave number band to CoA top on steps or defect sides. Now, it is important to note that even though we can confidently assign the band at 2045 wave numbers to CoA top on terrace sides, we cannot distinguish between CO top bound to 100 electrodes and 100 facets or 111 facets on the basis of the peak frequency alone. Why is that the case? That is the case because the CO stretch frequency of a top bound CO on copper 100 and 111 are essentially identical. Now, another way of assessing the structure of the electrode is through the adsorption and desorption of hydroxide. Now, to this end, we employed cyclic voltammetry. So we took these cyclic voltammograms of copper 100 and copper 111 electrodes at a pH of 13. And you can see these cyclic voltammograms contain adsorption and desorption peaks due to the adsorption and desorption of hydroxide. And you can see these peaks, or the potentials of these peaks, are specific to a specific exposed crystallographic facet. So the peak potentials of these bands identify a specific crystallographic facet. Now, we carried out also cyclic voltammograms on our polycrystalline films, and indeed on the copper silicon electrode, we find a peak that is consistent with the desorption of hydroxide from 100 facets. Now, we do not see the corresponding adsorption peak, most likely due to the small amplitude of these peaks and also due to the sloping baseline. However, on the basis of this result, we can state that the copper silicon film is apparently rich in 100 facets. On the other hand, the cyclic voltammogram of the copper gold silicon reveals a peak that is consistent with the adsorption of hydroxide on a 111 facet. So that result leads us to conclude that the copper gold silicon electrode is rich in 111 facets. Now, these cyclic voltammograms are reproducible over many cycles. Here we show the 10th cycle of each electrode, but these features can also be observed in all prior cycles. Now, this characterization was carried out at high pH, so it is important to ask if this characterization of the electrodes informs about the state of the surface at low pH, at neutral pH, where our spectroscopy was carried out and where we also carried out our DEMS measurements. So we carried out control experiments, both DEMS and spectroscopy, at high pH, and we found the same trends that I just reported for the neutral pH conditions. So we're confident that this CV characterization also informs about the surface state at neutral pH. Now, with this knowledge, we are now equipped to interpret the CO stretch line shapes in terms of a simple Boltzmann model that considers the relative CO population on defect sites and on terrace sites. So that ratio is given by the relative concentration or density of defect versus terrace sites and this exponential factor. Now, we have spectroscopic data that suggests that the concentration of defect sites is not significantly different between the two different electrodes. So therefore, we exclude this prefactor as being the origin of the different line shapes on the two types of electrodes. So therefore, the exponential factor must be responsible for giving rise to these different line shapes. Now here I should emphasize this delta E is defined now here in terms of desorption energies, which are positive quantities, and the larger the number, the stronger the CO binds to that particular facet. Now here, these results are from temperature program desorption studies by Waegele and co-workers. And again, as a reminder on the copper, so if we now look at the energy difference between CO a top on defect versus terrace sites, that energy difference is larger on copper gold silicon, which is rich in 111 facets, in comparison to the energy gap on copper silicon, which is rich in 100 facets. Now, this fact means that on the basis of the simple Boltzmann model, the CO population on terrace sites on copper silicon is 5 times as high as the population on the prevalent terrace sites on the copper gold silicon film. Let me show this here in terms of a cartoon. So on copper silicon, the predominant facet is 100. 100 binds CO relatively strongly in comparison to 111 facets. That gives rise to a significant population of CO on the prevalent facet on this electrode, and that gives rise to that distinct band at 2045 wave numbers. Only at more cathodic potentials do we observe then the 2080 wave number band, which is due to CO on defect size. And I would like to point out here, this band, as we tune the potential more negatively, completely dominates the spectrum. Why is that the case? This is the case because of dynamical dipole coupling within the CO add layer. And we explored that dynamical dipole coupling on these copper electrodes quite extensively with isotope dilution experiments. And I can comment on that more in the Q&A session if there's interest. Now, on the other hand, on the copper gold silicon, on which the 111 facet is prevalent, which binds CO relatively weakly, the 2045 wave number band never develops as a distinct band, and the spectrum is dominated at all potentials by CO on defect size. Now we're in a position to actually understand why copper silicon is more active for CC bond formation in comparison to copper gold silicon. Indeed, Koper and co-workers have shown that with their single crystal studies that the onset potential for ethylene on a copper 100 crystal is about 200 millivolts more cathodic than on copper 111, and probably fortuitously we find actually a similar shift for our polycrystalline electrodes, where we can also say that the copper silicon is rich in 100, whereas the copper gold silicon is rich in 111 facets. Now with this, I'd like to conclude this second part of my talk. We were able to demonstrate a new spectroscopic method that we believe can be quite powerful in assessing the atomic level surface morphology of electrodes with complex surface structures. And it's not only limited to surface enhanced infrared absorption spectroscopy, but it could also be applied in SEIRS measurements, in surface enhanced Raman measurements. Surface enhanced Raman is suitable for probing a wide variety of rough metal electrodes, so it could be used as an additional tool to characterize surface morphology or the atomic level surface morphology in situ or under electrocatalytic conditions. And using this spectroscopic method and our CV analysis, we were able to identify the predominant surface facets and on two types of model electrodes. And using that information, we were able to explain why one electrode is more effective in forming CC bonds in comparison to the other. Now, I'd like to conclude my talk by going back to this original cartoon that I showed. I mentioned that what we want to do is we want to understand how the interfacial structure at the electrode controls product selectivity. And in this talk, I showed you two examples. In the first talk, or in the first part of the talk, I showed you an example of that we were able to identify an intermolecular interaction between water and surface absorbed CO that is apparently essential for the formation of ethylene. And in the second part of my talk, I was able to show you a new spectroscopic method that could be used to identify the prevalent surface facets on electrodes of complex surface morphologies. And with this, I'd like to acknowledge my research team. They're really outstanding people. I'd like to acknowledge specifically for this work. For the first part, I'd like to acknowledge Shang and Jingyi, who have led the first part of my talk, and also Julie, an undergraduate student who was involved in this work. And the second part that the first part that I talked about was led by Charuni. And I also like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation, which has essentially funded this research direction in our lab since the very early days. Now, with this, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Matthias, for a very clear talk and also showing all of what you've been doing with CO2 reduction. I see that now Karen is also online.
Hi there, Matthias.
Oh, hi there.
I'm so sorry I didn't manage to introduce you, but thank you so much for your talk. That was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I truly appreciate it.
I have a couple questions, but I see that there's already a lineup. So Nitish, are you going to?
Yeah, so maybe I'll read a couple of them and then you can ask your questions. And then, yeah. Okay, so first question is by Jeff Lowe. And the question is, thank you for the wonderful talk. The question regards to the first half of the talk. So in the paper by Bell and co-workers and Jax that you cited at the beginning of your talk, the authors found increased ethylene selectivity with larger cation size, but your results show the opposite effect. Could you comment on that?
Yes. So the mechanisms are quite different. So so we have here organic cations that, based on the spectroscopy, have a very specific impact on the water. Specifically, the largest cation, tetrabutyl ammonium, is supposedly quite hydrophobic. So when it gets attracted to the electrode, when we go more negative in potential, it expels water. So I see here that's more like a hydrophobic effect, or it has this impact on the structure of water that the alkali metal cations that were used by Bell and co-workers do not have. So there's an additional interaction here in these organic cations that is just not present for the alkali metal cations.
I'm sorry, if I can just add something, because I was part of that paper too, so I feel like I should say something about that. So what we have found with Bell is actually the cesium ions, at least when we consider the hydrated size, they're actually smaller. So it's actually quite consistent with what yeah. So lithium actually has a larger hydrated ion size, and so we can use the same kind of field picture.
Right, and also I should point out the sizes of the cations that I mentioned here were derived from thermodynamic quantities, so from the partial molar volumes of these cations. So I'm not sure how to think about it, but I believe they will also, to some extent, the numbers that I cited will to some extent include some type of hydration.
Yeah.
Okay, so great. So the next question is by Hendrik Heenan, and the question is, great talk. Why does 111 facet dominate on the copper gold silicon electrode?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So so there is studies by Soryaga and co-workers, very beautiful studies where they use electrochemical STM on polycrystalline copper electrodes at high pH. And what they were able to show in the electrochemical STM, that actually under cathodic polarization and at high pH, the electrode exhibits 100 faceting. So it appears that under electrochemical conditions, at least under high pH conditions, the 100 facet seems to be the most stable facet of copper in an electrochemical context. Now, in regards to our copper gold silicon, why does this not have a 100 facet? I think that has to do with a substrate. So actually these gold films, which are produced through also an electroless deposition, these gold films have a preferential 111 orientation. So now we electrochemically deposit copper on top of that. So I believe there is some pseudomorphic growth of that copper overlayer on that gold film.
Okay, great. Next question is by Guana Lee. And the question is on slide 35. The intensity of the copper gold silicon is very weak compared to copper 111, right? And so if you can go back, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so this peak intensity that you show, it's really weak, right? And the question is, why is that the case?
You mean these peaks here?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think I have a very good answer to that. It's on the polycrystalline surface, there are certainly, defects. There are certainly other facets present. So I can't speak to what extent that would affect the adsorption of hydroxide. So I'm not aware of any literature that has tried what we tried on a polycrystalline foil. There's a lot of very interesting work on single crystals, but not on polycrystalline foil. So I can only speculate that this is most likely due to intrinsically that polycrystalline nature, and that we have other defects and so forth also present that just reduce the amplitude of that peak.
Okay, great. So maybe Karen, you can ask your question.
Okay, so with regards to your, sorry, okay, I'm unmuted. Okay, so with regards to your field effects, so I mean, I totally would agree that, say, for CO, when it interacts with field, it's a very small effect, because the dipole is really small. But if we consider that it's CO-CO dimerization that's rate limiting, then the CO-CO dimer itself has a really, really large dipole. So could that not contribute also here when you're changing the field the way that you do?
And that's absolutely a fair point. We have not tested that. I mean, we could plug it in basically and see to what extent that changes things. So, but I agree that there could be other intermediates such as the CO dimer with a larger dipole moment, with a larger polarizability, where that field strength may have an effect. So that is certainly within the realm of possibility. We can't exclude that. The other point that I want to make in regards to that question is when we experimentally, we calculate the average electric field. But for example, in your work, you have very beautifully shown that actually the electric field strength very quickly decays away from the cation, right? It's just within a few angstroms, you get very large electric fields. Now we measure the average electric field. So there could be, I think of these cations probably as dynamic centers that, move around. And if they encounter, for example, a dimer or a CO, it could be that transiently a large field is produced that then, gives rise to catalyst turnover. It's difficult to address that experimentally, simply because the cation concentration at the surface supposedly is quite small. So we are always seeing the most prevalent, the average, what the average CO is seeing, which may not be truly representative in terms of the catalysis, right? So these are kind of the two qualifying. So in terms of our conclusions, I think these are two qualifying statements that are important to make here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah. So the next question is by Ranga Rohit. And the question is, thanks for your great talk. If the temperature of the IR experiments is reduced, is there a way to observe the peaks corresponding to CO adsorbed on copper 111 as well?
Oh, so we have not done temperature studies. So yes, so the temperature, that would potentially be interesting, but we haven't done that. So that could be, yeah, it could be possible, yeah, but we haven't done any temperature dependent studies.
Okay, great. The next question is by Jae-Chol Choi. And the question is, thanks for the nice talk. For the first half of your presentation, have you had any chance to measure Faradic efficiency for ethylene with the different cations?
The answer is no. So that's an interesting question. So what we focused on is kind of more semi-quantitatively saying, you know, there is, so we can confidently say there's ethylene when we have tetramethyl and tetraethyl ammonium. There's the ethylene formations below the detection limit in the presence of the two larger cations. Our setup does not, at the present time, allow for the quantification, and that has to do with that setup, because you bring that tip close to the electrode, and the collection efficiency is in part determined of how precisely, or it's a sensitive function of that distance. So we can reproduce that within a certain level of accuracy, but still there are some, I mean, we are not able to quantify or calculate the Faraday efficiency. We're currently working on a flow cell. So one also downside of the current setup that we're having is it's static electrolyte, and whenever you have a static electrolyte, you have to worry about interfacial pH drifts and how they impact your catalysis. So we're currently working on a DEMS flow cell where we can do spectroscopy and DEMS at the same time. There are some technical challenges associated with that, but I'm quite optimistic that we're going to be able to solve those. And then we would have essentially a very, a well-defined structure, geometry, and then we can calibrate and calculate Faraday efficiencies. But on the basis of the current setup, we can't do that.
Okay, great. So the only C2 product that you detect is ethylene, or do you also see like ethanol and other C2?
No, we have not looked at ethanol. So ethylene we find is fairly straightforward to detect, simply because it's kind of the predominant product apparently on these electrodes under our conditions, but we have not looked for other C2 products.
Okay, great. Next question is by Hendrik, and the question is, great talk, very insightful. So the potential of zero charge for the copper that you showed, it was at about -1.1 versus SHE. This appears to be negative, at least compared to older studies. Can you comment on that?
Yes. So it's significantly more negative, I think, in, I don't want to misspeak now, but I think in sodium perchlorate on polycrystalline copper electrodes, or also single crystal electrodes, I think the potential of zero charge is around -0.75 or so. So we're probably like 0.4 electron volts or 0.4 volts or so more negative. Yeah. So there's two parts to answer this question. The first is we have different types of cations and anions that may specifically adsorb, which, for example, the sodium perchloride would not. So that would be consistent with a more negative potential of zero charge. We just need to go more negative to, for example, repel any specifically adsorbed, let's say, anions, like our borate or chloride, depending on what anion we have been using. The second answer to the question is our potential of zero charge may be different from the electrochemical potential of zero charge that is typically measured in, with electrochemical methods, because all we're saying here is, right, it is the point at which our CuAu probe feels no electric field, or an electric field strength of 0. That is kind of the point that we're determining. Now the electric field, you as a theorist, you know that it can be quite complex, right, as at the interface. So we identify essentially the point at which our CuAu probe feels zero charge, zero electric field strength. But that could conceivably be different from what is measured with electrochemical methods.
So maybe in connection to this question, you also said that, so one of the cations does not, so it does not pass through this -1.1 versus SHE, right? In the figure.
Say this again, sorry.
So in the figure that you had, you said that one of them does not pass through the -1.1.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. We can go back to that. This one. So if you see that's shifted,
yeah,
that has to do with two things. So I think, so this tetramethyl is shifted up, and you can also see the error bars are quite larger. I mean, the other error bars are actually very good reproducibility. But for the tetramethyl ammonium, you can see there's a bit more error to it. And we have some spectroscopic evidence that suggests that there's probably a more direct interaction between tetramethyl ammonium and our surface compared to the other cations, and that manifests itself in two ways. In tetramethyl ammonium, we find that our copper thin films have a higher propensity to peel off from the crystal. So that suggests that somehow the tetramethyl ammonium is interacting more strongly with our electrode surface in comparison to the other three cations. The other thing is that originally when we started out with this study, one reason why we wanted to also use organic cations is that, you know, with the infrared spectroscopy, we should be able to see the CH stretches, and we wanted to actually potentially quantify the amount of cations that we have at the interface as a function of applied potential. Now, it turned out that in the spectroscopy that we did not see the CH stretch bands associated with the three larger cations, but we did see a little bit of some peak structure in the CH stretch region when we use tetramethyl ammonium. So that again suggests that it's kind of more closely interacting with the electrode. And that's also consistent with the Helmholtz double layer estimates that I showed, which really suggests that the cation is pretty close to the surface. Okay,
great. I think the next question is also somewhat related, which is, what would happen if you use just ammonia, like NH4 plus as a cation? Is it too reactive to interfere with the reaction being studied? And what happens to the solvation shell around these cations? That is
yeah, so that's interesting. I'm not sure about NH4 plus if it, you know, if we would induce another interaction. I mean, it certainly, it would potentially, I mean, it would most likely act as a proton donor, which could, you know, complicate things in that sense that now you change the system quite drastically, right? So that's probably one issue I see there, but it could certainly be insightful.
Yeah. Okay. And then the second part of the question is there an influence of the anion that you use? So borate versus phosphate or something?
Right. So in this study, we used two types of cations. For most of the spectroscopy that I showed you, we use chloride. For the DEMS, we mostly, as I mentioned, we use the borate because then we have a nice pH buffer. But we did control experiments with the spectroscopy and borate that checks out. I mean, we didn't see any difference in terms of compared to the chloride. And also with the DEMS, we did some test experiments just with chloride unbuffered, and you know, we saw again the same trends. Okay. So it doesn't look like the anion has a significant influence here. We have a recent paper where we actually looked at the influence of anions on the adsorption of Cl, which just appeared a few weeks ago, and we also didn't see any drastic changes. So we actually tried perchlorate, chloride, and I forgot now the third one. Oh, sulfate. Yeah.
Great. And then Karen, do you have another question?
Yeah, sure. I was looking at your copper versus copper gold. So that onset shift looks really good. And I was wondering, like, do you think we can translate that to a turnover frequency? Like, would that be indicative of such a lot, I mean, of a large shift in turnover frequency? Because that would be the intrinsic activity.
Right. So in this work, we really tried not to, interpret the amplitude here. So we kind of focused on the onset potential. So this is what Mark Koper and others who employed similar setups have mostly been doing. There are some reports where they also look more at the quantity. We were not quite confident with our setup to really say that, again, that goes back to the Faradaic efficiency and so forth, that we can, quantitatively interpret that other than the onset potential.
It's better, but we don't really know how much.
Right. So again, like we're trying to work on that flow cell, which could then, then we could certainly answer these questions. Also, you can see that for the copper gold, you see actually, I mean, the onset potential is very similar, but actually this one produces apparently more methane. And, if you look at the supporting information of our paper, we actually repeated, I think, each measurement 3 or 4 times. I can't remember exactly, but this result here also seems quite consistent. We didn't interpret it, but it would be also consistent that 111 produces more methane than ethylene. So so yeah, there are some features in there that it seems like you can potentially at least qualitatively say, yes, there's a higher turnover, but how much that is, I would be careful.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so there's another question by Hongyu An, and the question is, thanks for the great talk. If we say the fraction of CO on defect and CO on terrace sites is determined by Boltzmann statistics, does it mean that we have far more adsorption sites available, both defect and terrace sites, than actual number of CO molecules? Otherwise, the amount of available sites would determine the distribution.
So the absolute, so one thing is, we cannot unfortunately determine the absolute coverage of CO on the electrode. But based on some estimates in an electrochemical context, probably similar to the reaction conditions that we are employing, you're certainly below a full monolayer of CO. So you're probably, at 0.3 monolayers or so, but this is again more based on, I think, calculations that have been published, where they plot, surface coverage as a function of applied potential based on DFT results. I think Hori also tried to estimate some of these things, but unfortunately with this. There's no good way to determine the absolute coverage of CO on copper. And the reason for that is that it's reversibly bound to the electrode, unlike on platinum electrodes, where you can just purge all your CO in the electrolyte away, and then you do electrostripping and you just count electrons, and then you know how many CO molecules you had on your surface. Unfortunately for the copper system, you can't do that. And it's really a shortcoming, because I think the spectroscopy could be so much more insightful if we could really tell, how much CO we actually have in terms of absolute coverage. But yeah, I think the answer to the question is we're well below the saturation coverage.
Okay, great. I see that there's no more questions in the chat. So if you have another question, Karen.
Actually, I think I'm good. So,
okay, great.
But thank you again, Matthias. That was a really, really interesting talk. It was super deep, and it gave me a lot to think about.
Well, thank you very much again for the invitation. I truly appreciated the opportunity. It's really great. As I mentioned, I learned so much from your work. So it's really great that we got to know each other, even virtually.
Well, I hope we get to really know each other.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks everyone for attending. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.